Okay, welcome everyone to the Get Housing Right Conference presented by the University of Rhode Island Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies with support from Homes RI. My name is Skip Mark. I'm director of the center and a political scientist here at URI. Before we begin, I just want to mention some of the logistics. So this is the start of day one, and if you stay in this link, you'll be able to access all of the panels for the day in the A block. If you'd like to access the B block panels, which are the right to housing, which begins at 11:30, and zoning for housing access at 1:30, you can find the link in the same email that was automatically generated and allowed you to get in here. And at any point, you can re-access the A block panels with the link that you use to log in here. Tomorrow, we're going to be meeting in person at the URI Shepherd building, and it's not too late to register. So if you get really excited and you want to join us in person tomorrow, there's plenty of time. And we're going to have a presentation today, and afterwards, if you have questions, please type it in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen next to the raise hand and chat boxes. We're going to try and get through as many questions as we can. So today's opening plenary features Diane Yentel, President and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. Diane is going to present for about 20 minutes, and then we have put in about 25 minutes for Q&A. So there should be plenty of time to have a lively conversation and get into a really important and increasingly pressing issue that is facing not just the United States, but the world as a whole. So without further ado, I want to pass it over to Diane and get into a really exciting presentation and thank her once again for joining us.
Great, thanks so much. I'm glad to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to be back virtually, at least in Rhode Island. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk a bit about the affordable housing crisis and its solutions. We certainly have our work cut out for us. These last 2 years have been such a watershed moment for our country. They showed us in really profound and unforgettable ways who we are, and we can't go back. The years laid bare the deep structural racism on which our country and so many of its systems was built, and how that structural racism can harm and kill Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And it made clear our collective responsibility to repair this deep injustice, to work towards racial and housing justice. The years revealed the collective harm that comes from allowing homelessness and housing poverty to persist, and to make clear that housing is healthcare. It always has been. And that stable, affordable, accessible homes are a prerequisite to personal and public health. The years revealed the pervasive housing crisis for the lowest income people who struggled so mightily to pay rent before the pandemic and during the pandemic, and who will continue to struggle after the pandemic, unless and until the federal government invests in solutions to make homes affordable to the lowest income people. The years showed us how quickly and effectively the country can implement protections and resources to keep renters and unhoused people safe and housed. And the years really showed us as housing advocates, organizers, providers, tenant leaders, impacted people, how deep and broad is our movement for housing justice, and how powerful and effective we can be when we work together. Because as difficult as the years have been, we rose to the challenge and achieved unprecedented resources and protections for renters and people experiencing homelessness. In August of 2020, the best available data made clear that up to 12 million households were at risk of losing their homes if the government didn't act. These were many of the same families who had struggled to pay the rent before the pandemic, but now had lost jobs, hours at work, wages, and had increased childcare, internet, healthcare, and other costs. So by August of 2020, the small patchwork of pandemic protections and resources had expired, and renters stood on the edge of a cliff. Advocates sounded the alarm, and federal, state, and local governments acted, providing historic resources and protections to keep tenants housed. Together, we fought for and kept in place a national moratorium on evictions for non-payment of rent. This was historic, unprecedented. In the history of our country, there has been nothing like such a broad protection to keep renters housed. And against all odds, and despite some very powerful, very well-funded opponents, we kept that moratorium in place for almost a year. Together, we also achieved $46.5 billion in emergency rental assistance. Again, an unprecedented level of support for low-income renters. For perspective, that's more than 46 times what the federal government allocated to help renters during the Great Recession. It's the largest allocation of resources exclusively for renters in history. And once we achieved those historic resources, we worked together with the White House, Treasury, HUD, state and local partners, program administrators, impacted people to build a new national infrastructure to get these vital resources to the tenants most in need to keep them stably housed. As many of you probably know, emergency rental assistance got off to a painfully slow start. It was caught between two administrations, and it was slow work to build a major new network and new programs during a global pandemic. And it takes time to design effective programs that center and prioritize the lowest income and the most marginalized people. Now, today, as of the end of March, nearly 5 million emergency rental assistance payments have been made. And ERA has reached nearly 10 million people in over 3.5 million households. And the data make clear that our collective efforts to ensure that these funds reach the lowest income and the most marginalized people is working. The households that have so far received assistance are predominantly very low and extremely low income, and they are disproportionately people of color, the very people who are at the greatest risk of eviction if they didn't receive assistance. And this successful alignment of resources to those with the greatest and the clearest needs happens only with deliberate and purposeful program design and outreach, as so many of us worked so hard to achieve. At the same time, we work together with partners throughout the country to get state and local governments to do more to protect renters. And our partners and allies throughout the country, many of you included, advocated for successfully for state and local governments to enact or implement over 130 new tenant protections in 2021 alone. So it was these historic and unprecedented actions, together with broader pandemic stimulus relief of stimulus checks and expanded unemployment insurance and child tax credits, that kept millions of families safely housed during the pandemic. But now new challenges await. Those same renters that struggled to keep a roof over their heads during the pandemic continue to struggle today, and even more so as rents are skyrocketing throughout the country. Our country has a shortage of 7 million homes affordable and available to the lowest income people, predominantly people of color. So another way of saying that same number is for every 10 of the lowest income families, there are fewer than 4 apartments that are affordable and available to them. In Delaware, the shortage is even more severe. For every 10 of the lowest income households, there are about 3 apartments that are affordable and available to them. Despite this shortage, in some ways, the shortage is a result of having a system in our country where only 1 in every 4 households that are eligible for and in need of housing assistance receives any. So we have what is a housing lottery system in our country, where only the lucky 25% gets the help that they need. So emergency rental assistance and eviction moratoriums were essential, but they were only ever a temporary patch to the gaping holes in our social safety net. They do nothing to address the deep structural flaws in our country's housing system. So sure enough, in those communities where renter protections are expiring or where emergency rental assistance has been depleted, eviction filings are again reaching and in some places surpassing pre-pandemic levels. Some communities now have eviction filing rates more than twice the rates prior to the pandemic. So these same long-standing pre-pandemic housing inequities will persist until we achieve permanent and robust tenant protections and investments in the long-term solutions needed to make homes affordable to lowest income people. So in the short term, right now, states and cities should do all they can to use the really ample state and local relief fund dollars that the federal government sent to fund immediate housing solutions as a bridge to longer term solutions. And Delaware Rhode Island has done well in putting some of this money towards affordable housing construction and homelessness shelters already. And but still there's much more that can be done here. And states and cities too should further expand tenant protections. And together we have to keep working towards the long-term solutions. The scale of the challenge requires a federal government intervention. So last year we launched a major new campaign, the Housed campaign, for universal, stable, affordable homes. And the Housed campaign works in parallel to our ever-expanding Opportunity Starts at Home campaign. The Opportunity Starts at Home campaign effectively mobilizes the healthcare, anti-poverty, anti-hunger, civil rights, education, and other sectors. The Housed campaign mobilizes the housing field, impacted people, organizers, state, local, national advocates. And together, we worked to ensure that investments in housing the lowest income people were included in the Build Back Better Act. Our collective advocacy helped get Build Back Better passed through the House with $150 billion in transformative housing investments. The bill included $65 billion for public housing repair and preservation to make nearly 3 million affordable homes that predominantly house people of color with extremely low incomes to be decent, quality, healthy, accessible homes. The bill includes $25 billion in rental assistance for over 300,000 new housing choice vouchers to start to put us on a path towards universal rental assistance. And the bill includes $15 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund to build or preserve over 150,000 homes affordable to the lowest income people. Taken together, these investments would be the largest in quality, affordable, accessible homes for our country's lowest income people in history. And as a movement, as a country, we have never been closer to investments like these that would transform our collective efforts to achieve housing justice. And it's our collective advocacy that made it possible. It is right within reach, but for one Democrat standing in the way. But even if we don't achieve it this year, which we still may, we are still pushing with all our might to get it done, we will be that much closer to the finish line the next time we have this window of opportunity, because together we have both moved the Democratic Party's stance on affordable housing to one that is much more ambitious, more willing to call for and fund solutions on the scale necessary, much more focused on solutions that are deeply targeted to the lowest income people. And we have built bipartisan support for many of our solutions, if not always evident in Congress, then evident and clear from recent polls that we've done throughout the country. And while the housing crisis can feel complex, the solutions are actually pretty simple, even if they're not easy. There's 4 sets of solutions that, taken together, can end homelessness and housing poverty. And the solutions are about not only major new investments, but also about the essential anti-racist policies and reforms needed to ensure that these investments work for the Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who are so disproportionately harmed by today's housing system. So the first solution is to make rental assistance universally available to all eligible households in need. And this is something that President Biden, unlike any president before him, has committed to do. So we need to hold him to that commitment. And together with that major expansion, we will push for other national protections against source of income discrimination and other improvements to rental assistance to ensure that it works for BIPOC people and families. The second solution is to push to preserve and expand the supply of homes affordable to the lowest income renters through preserving and expanding our country's public housing infrastructure, through a major expansion of the National Housing Trust Fund, and with federal requirements or incentives for local zoning reform. The third solution is to push for the Emergency Rental Assistance Program to be permanent through a National Housing Stabilization Fund. We have worked so hard as a country to build this tremendous new infrastructure. We have an opportunity and an obligation to keep it in place and fully funded, and to help those renters absorb a financial shock that could otherwise lead to eviction and the spiraling into poverty that results. And fourth, we must rebalance the power that tilts so heavily in favor of landlords at the expense of renters, and predominantly at the expense of Black women renters who are much more likely to be evicted. So we are working to advance robust renter protections like right to counsel, just cause evictions, expunging eviction records, and more. So we will keep building, expanding, deepening our movement. And as we do, we all must deepen our commitment to and our work on racial equity. So in the last couple of years, NLHC has undertaken an organization-wide initiative to advance racial equity and inclusion in our policy analysis and advocacy, our research, organizing, internal operations, external relationships. And we do this because of the obvious and unacceptable racial disparities in housing. As you all likely know, there are tremendous racial disparities in housing, and these disparities didn't happen by chance. Decades of racist housing policies purposefully put homeownership out of reach for millions of Black Americans, creating this yawning generational wealth gap that persists today. This and the result of this and structural racism in multiple other systems and multiple other ways is clear in the racial disparities in housing and homelessness. And you see the starkest example of this in the work that many of us do every day. Black people represent about 13% of the general population, but they are 40% of people experiencing homelessness and 50% of homeless families with kids. These kind of disproportionate outcomes don't happen by chance. So just as deliberate racist housing policies created and maintain racial disparities in housing today, it's only through deliberate anti-racist housing policies that we will reverse the harm done and start to achieve racial equity in our country. So housing justice and racial justice are really inextricably linked. So we have so much work to do, and the challenges truly are daunting. Racial injustices persist. ERA, emergency rental assistance, is running out while significant needs remain. Homelessness is increasing in many communities, and with it, a backlash against obvious solutions is also increasing. Rents are skyrocketing, public housing is deteriorating, long-term solutions, so obvious, so easily funded by a country as wealthy as ours, remain just out of reach. So these challenges should only strengthen our resolve to keep fighting. You know, I have long said in speech after speech and conversation after conversation, as many of us have, that the only thing we lack as a country to end homelessness is the political will to do it. You know, certainly we have the data, we have the solutions. As a country, we have the resources. We have only ever lacked the political will, and the pandemic proved it. So when our movement for housing justice saw the danger the pandemic posed, we aligned with a singular focus to protect people who are homeless and struggling renters, to save lives and to keep people stably housed. And we did. And when government at all levels recognized the emergency and the need and prioritized it, it acted and funded solutions on a scale unlike any in our lifetimes. Together in just 2 years, we achieved what just 3 years ago we would have said was unthinkable, impossible. So now, on those days when our goals feel impossible, or when the difficulties of the work and the challenges seem insurmountable, on these days when we feel like we can't or we won't, we have to remember that we achieved the unimaginable, we did the impossible, and together we can and we will do it again. We will keep struggling and fighting until we end homelessness and housing poverty, until we achieve housing justice once and for all. So thanks again so much for the opportunity to be here. I appreciate all of the work that all of you do day in and day out to work, to believe and to lead towards solutions to end homelessness and housing poverty. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I look forward to the conversation.
Oh, thank you so much. So I'm going to invite people to type a question into the Q&A box. So we're just going to focus on the questions that show up there. But I'll get the ball rolling while people are typing their questions. So some critics would probably argue, right, that while we've been able to generate a lot of resources during the pandemic, these are really costly, and we simply can't pay for it. It's going to increase the debt too much, right? As one of the richest countries in the world, as you mentioned, right? How should we think about funding and the potential benefits that these policies would have to the economy as well, rather than just the price tag?
Sure, I get that comment a lot, as you can imagine, when I talk to people on the Hill about the solutions that we're pursuing, and it's so easy and obvious to me to respond and to remind people that inaction is expensive. Like, it's not like we don't pay to allow homelessness and housing poverty to persist. We do, we pay for it. Certainly individual families and children pay for it, local communities pay for it, we pay for it as a country. You know, we have so much clear research that shows that when people are affordably housed, our health improves and healthcare costs are reduced. Our kids do better in school. They achieve greater educational attainment. We earn more over our lifetimes and pay more in taxes, local taxes. We can even live longer depending on which community we're in. And there are just reams and reams of data about how Medicaid costs are reduced by about 12%, how emergency room visits are decreased by about 18%, all when people are affordably housed. There was a study, one of my favorite studies to quote came from Children's Health Watch, which is a group of pediatricians at a Boston Medical Center. And they found that over the next 10 years, we'll spend $111 billion in avoidable healthcare costs because of housing instability and homelessness. So we're paying to allow homelessness to persist. We could instead invest in the solutions and actually over time save money to the federal government.
Wonderful. What initiatives has Rhode Island done to address homelessness? A project or program that could be a model. So do you have a project or program that could be a model? And if you know anything about some of the initiatives Rhode Island has done.
That's hard for me to answer. I would hate to miss something that's obvious. I would defer to Rhode Island advocates to be able to share the best work that's been done here.
Do you have a project or program that you've seen around the country that could be a model? Or
well, there's so many different ways to look at that question. I mean, top of mind, I think for many of us over the last couple of years has been emergency rental assistance and what we've learned about how to get cash into the pockets of low-income renters so that they can pay rent that they owe. And we learned a tremendous amount through this national pilot program about what works and what doesn't. And some of the clearest takeaways, best practices from that can be applied to other programs as well that serve low-income people is keeping programs as simple and as accessible as possible is going to ensure that the lowest income and the most marginalized people can get those resources. So this can apply to homeless shelters and services. This can apply to affordable housing. It certainly applies to emergency rental assistance. When applications are pages and pages too long, when you're only able to apply for a program through the internet, when there's not dedicated outreach to marginalized communities in languages that they're most comfortable with, then you are leaving out the very people who need the assistance the most. So in any of the systems that we create, we should be mindful of ensuring that these systems are designed in a way that can reach the lowest income and the most marginalized people.
All right, next question. The state of Rhode Island today is anticipating a budget surplus of about $600 million. And legislators are considering a number of tax breaks for Rhode Islanders. One is a negative housing tax on housing consumption and capital gains from home sales. And so a negative housing tax is for those above some income level, they would pay to the state, and those below it would receive sort of a tax break. This is supported by Casey Dawkins in Just Housing. So what do you think about policies like that?
I think that the best use of any resources that states or cities have when it comes to housing and homelessness is to make sure that they're going to the people with the greatest needs. So the data are so clear that in Rhode Island and throughout the country, it is extremely low-income households who have tremendous housing needs. And I think, too, as long as there is homelessness in a community, if we are working on affordable housing, if there's money available to apply to housing needs, it should go towards alleviating, addressing and ending homelessness first and foremost. Not necessarily entirely. There are needs certainly beyond people experiencing homelessness in a community, but there's no doubt that that is where the greatest need lies. And so the budget surplus that you all have is an incredible opportunity now to do some of the things that many people in Rhode Island have wanted to do for years around ending homelessness, around building and preserving apartments affordable to extremely low-income people, around creating a bridge for emergency rental assistance, supplementing the program that will likely soon be depleted in the state. This is what some other states are doing with their state and local relief funds. So, which is probably a big reason why Rhode Island has the surplus that it does. The Congress provided $350 billion in state and local relief fund to the entire country. And we have been going through all of the state and localities' plans to use those funds. And we found that of the 350 billion, at last look, a little over 12 billion of that is being set aside for housing and homelessness. That's good. That's really important. That's $12 billion that wasn't being spent previously, but it's out of 350 billion, and much more can be done. In Rhode Island, I believe it's about 23 million that the state has set aside for housing and homelessness. That's very good. It's more than what many states are doing. But I would really urge and encourage you to do more, to use these resources to do what we haven't been able to do for many, many years, because it will be probably at least as long before there are such surpluses throughout the country again.
Wonderful. So Lauren Pineda asked, what is your advice to future MPA graduates who want to get involved in housing initiatives? Are there organizations you would recommend looking into?
Well, I'd recommend looking into ours, the National Income Housing Coalition. There's certainly a need for more people to get involved in affordable housing at all levels, I'd say, and in many ways is what I mean. Whether through advocacy, through direct service, through construction and operating of affordable housing. There are so many ways to get engaged in the work of ending homelessness and ending housing poverty. Of course, I'm in this work because I really believe that what's most needed is systemic change to the entire country's system, and that happens most at the federal level, and federal advocacy to push for these kind of solutions. We need more voices. We need more people. So do look into the National Income Housing Coalition. You can find on our website all of the initiatives that we do. We do have internships. We do occasionally have volunteer opportunities as ways to sort of step in and try out the work. But I would just encourage you to keep going and stay involved in housing and homelessness, because there's so much work to do.
Wonderful. Housing Works Rhode Island asked, Rhode Island's congressional delegation is very supportive of housing. What else can we do to encourage them to do more, potentially in partnership with our New England colleagues?
Yeah, Rhode Island has a terrific delegation, a lot of strong leaders that have supported and advocated for affordable housing for many, many years. Similarly, with the broader delegation within New England, I'd say the challenge, the thing that we need to keep working on, the challenge that we always end up coming up against, is when push comes to shove and progressive or other policymakers have to choose the top two things they want to get done out of their list of 10 or 20. How do we make sure that housing, affordable housing, is on that list of two? And this has been a challenge that we've struggled with for many, many years. And it came up again through Build Back Better, despite our efforts, despite our incredible congressional champions, including from Rhode Island and throughout New England, despite our getting $150 billion in housing and Build Back Better, when it started to become clear, and it's still part of the conversation, that if anything is going to move forward, it's going to have to be even more reduced than that. And in some ways, it becomes a choice between the extended child tax credit or affordable housing. And it's an impossible choice, right? Because both are going to help the same people. But for many key members of Congress, they would choose, if they had to pick between the two, they would say the child tax credit. And this is the kind of thing that happens again and again. If their affordable housing is a priority, yes, but not always then when you have only two things to pick. Housing doesn't stay there. So we just have to keep working with our members of Congress, all of them, to help them understand how central housing is to all of the other issues that they care about, and how stable, affordable housing can achieve the same very similar end results for the people they care most about, or that the other areas where they want to work to help people's lives improve through better health or better educational attainment can't be achieved until people are affordably housed. So that's the message that we really just need to keep working on with our best allies and with our biggest critics as well.
Absolutely. So you mentioned sort of tying affordable housing to some of these other issues. And Josephine asked, is there a way to match the availability of affordable housing with available jobs? So should we think of housing in conjunction with some of these other issues, such as, unemployment, healthcare issues, poverty?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I fully understand the question, but I would say that I'm not sure if the person is asking about, should we be building and preserving housing that's affordable, especially where the jobs are, which the answer is that the question? Okay, so yes. One of the things about the housing crisis is that, as I said earlier, it's not easy. It's pretty simple, but there is no silver bullet answer to the affordable housing crisis. While there's themes and threads that all communities share, individual communities experience the affordable housing crisis. The crisis manifests differently in different communities, right? And for example, in some places, there are literally not enough apartments for all of the people who live in or want to live in that community. And so the obvious solution is we need to build more apartments, make them affordable to the lowest income people. And we need to do that in the places where the jobs are, where people are moving to. That becomes harder to guess where that will be, especially now when we are moving into a whole new world of work, with many people working virtually or continuing to work virtually or in hybrid situations. That's really changing some of the housing dynamics in many communities. But it will always be true that in the places where there is simply not enough apartments for the people who need them, that we need to build more. There are other places where there are a sufficient number of apartments, but the people who live in them can't afford them. And so those are the places where we need to have that bridge between what people earn and what housing costs. And that happens through rental assistance, longer term rental assistance. So yes, we should be thinking about ways to align resources to where people can have the most success in their lives. But we should also have as an underlying principle the matter of choice, that low income people, just like higher income people, ultimately our goal is that they have the choice of where to live based on what's best for them and their families. And we can only really achieve that choice if we're ensuring that housing is affordable to them in all communities, in urban, suburban, and rural communities alike.
Wonderful. Patty asks, New York State Constitution includes the right to shelter. So while it's not actually put into practice, but is the enactment of such language in other states a useful tactic?
It's such a good question, and it's complicated. So the right to shelter, yes, exists in New York City, and that's why, although New York has a greater population of people experiencing homelessness than California does, and than many of the cities in California do, most people don't perceive it that way, because in California there is not a right to shelter. There are not enough shelter beds for everyone who needs them. And in California, in recent years, more people experiencing homelessness are unsheltered than they are sheltered. So in New York City, most people experiencing homelessness are sheltered, and so they're less visible to the general public. So there's a sort of a perception that there are fewer homeless people in New York. That's not true. The challenge with right to shelter is twofold. One, that shelter doesn't end homelessness, right? Housing ends homelessness. And so when we are putting substantial resources towards addressing homelessness, wherever possible, we should be putting those resources towards the permanent solutions that help actually end homelessness for people. And that's housing. And sometimes that's permanent supportive housing with wraparound services as well, because shelter systems are very expensive. And so there are many communities that are shifting from this idea of right to shelter to right to housing. And of course, that's both are hard to achieve because it's expensive. And a right to housing is even harder to achieve because of all of the challenges related to the shortage of affordable housing for the lowest income people. But it's important that we keep our eye and put our resources towards those longer term solutions. At the same time, we have to recognize that it will take time in many of these communities to get these longer term solutions in place, and some kind of emergency response is necessary. And in that way, I think it's most important that we address homelessness through a public health crisis lens, rather than in many communities a criminal lens, or a sweeping of homeless encampments that just pop up again someplace else. And when it comes to the shelter system too, one of the things that we really learned during the pandemic is that we can redesign the way our emergency shelter system operates so that it can be much more humane and recognizing the dignity in individual people and providing individual spaces for people rather than congregate shelter. We've learned again and again that congregate shelters are not places that anybody really would want to be, including people experiencing homelessness, where single room occupancy, whether it's through hotels or motels or other deconcentrated shelters, are much more successful for everyone involved. So we have to have a continuum of solutions here. But when it comes to creating the right to something, I think we need to make it a right to housing.
Wonderful. David asks, have you seen any examples of landlords and tenants joining as affordable housing advocates as a result of the rent relief funds that sort of help both stakeholders? So do we see partnerships?
Yeah, there were absolutely partnerships during the pandemic. And when we were pushing for the emergency rental assistance, it was always clear that it was needed both for the tenants to ensure that they weren't burdened with more debt than they could pay off in their lifetimes. And it was essential for landlords, and especially the smaller landlords who need that rental income to be able to continue to maintain and operate their properties. So there were partnerships at the federal, state, and local levels, even in the advocacy, to get that emergency rental assistance allocated by Congress. And then certainly there have been many instances where landlords and tenants have worked together to ensure that they could get paid for the rent that was due. We've talked a lot about, because it has been a real problem, places where landlords were not willing to accept emergency rental assistance for a whole variety of reasons and the challenges that created. But there certainly were many instances of landlords being helpful with tenants in getting that money. In terms of partnerships for longer term advocacy on that, yes, too, there are landlord groups who push with us for longer term rental assistance. Again, there's an obvious benefit to landlords and to tenants if landlords are engaged in expanding the Section 8 voucher program. Yeah, I'll stop there. I was going to give another example, but it's a little off topic.
Zachary asks, how does adjusting zoning laws fit into solving the housing crisis?
It's essential. It's essential. Restrictive local zoning inhibits the supply of many times of any kind of apartment, and especially affordable apartments. There are places in the country where it's literally illegal to build apartments in certain neighborhoods. And there's no doubt that this restriction is making the lack of supply of apartments worse. And in many places, it is the reason why we are not able to build more apartments. It's also important to recognize that this kind of restrictive local zoning, that it prohibits the construction of especially multifamily housing, often is really deeply rooted in racial injustices. And it's historically in some communities was explicitly a method to keep Black and brown people out of historically white communities. So there are layers and layers of issues here at the local level that need to be confronted head on to have these restrictive local zoning laws loosened or removed. Obviously, by its name, it is a local decision, but there are things that the federal government can do too. There are some things the federal government has done under the Obama and the Biden administrations related to fair housing and holding back potentially housing dollars if local communities don't do more on restrictive local zoning. That's good. We should do more of that. But I think that's going to achieve incremental change at best. And frankly, I think we missed a huge opportunity in the major infrastructure spending package that Congress passed last fall. Those are the big dollars that every community wants. And the federal government should be using those levers to at least put incentives, if not requirements, for local governments to do more on zoning in order for them to receive those dollars. But it's also really important to recognize that even when we're successful in removing restrictive local zoning and increasing the supply of apartments, those apartments will not be affordable to extremely low income renters or people experiencing homelessness, because unless there are subsidies attached, because the private market on its own cannot build and operate apartments affordable to them, because the rent that they can pay can't cover the costs. So removing restrictive local zoning is important, and the federal subsidies to make those new apartments affordable to extremely low income people are essential.
Okay, I'm going to combine the next two questions because they're getting at something similar. So Frank and an anonymous attendee asked, besides voting, what can people do to address homelessness? And are there any sort of boots on the ground strategies to combat local municipal resistance to using ARPA funds in middle to high income communities?
Addressing homelessness, and can you say the second one about the ARPA funds?
Are there sort of boots on the ground strategies to combat local municipal resistance in middle to high income communities where you're trying to build housing for homeless or low income residents?
Sure. Yeah. That's a nice way of saying NIMBYism, right? I think. Yes, and they are absolutely combined. So, and somebody said without talking about voting, sure, no, there's much more that can be done right now. Again, when it comes to addressing homelessness in local communities, and especially as there's this increasing urgency at many local levels to address homelessness, as homelessness increases, and especially as visible homelessness increases, then more local people are concerned. They're calling their members of Congress or their local governments to complain, and those local governments feel urgency to act. So one, we have to ensure that we're not acting by punishing the very people who are experiencing homelessness, which unfortunately many communities do, whether through hostile infrastructure or through police sweeping encampments with no place for people living in them to go. And sure enough, those encampments then just pop up 2 blocks down the road a couple of weeks later. It's not a solution. So one, we have to address encampments and unsheltered homelessness as the public health crisis that it is. And we have to put in place measures to ensure that people who have no other option than to sleep in a tent can do so safely in a way that is safe for them, for the community in their encampment, and for the community that surrounds it. But ultimately, of course, what's most needed is housing, and in some cases, supportive services to help people stay housed. And again, local communities have a lot of money right now, more than they've had in a really long time. Those state and local relief fund dollars are huge to many local communities. They are experiencing surpluses unlike any they've seen in a long time. That money is such an opportunity to be spent, and that's just one bucket of money that's come in the last 2 years. There are many others as well. These surpluses are a tremendous opportunity to be spent to address these issues that are so difficult when there's no funding available. And it comes to that question of municipal activism. You know, the solutions, what's the quote? Solutions are made by those who show up, right? People who oppose local solutions, who oppose homeless shelters or supportive services or affordable housing in their communities, are much more likely to show up to the local conversations where those debates are had and where those decisions are made. And we need to balance that equation. There needs to be the people who support those solutions showing up and being at least as loud in their defense of those programs. So voting matters, absolutely, but even more so right now, spending the money that communities have wisely and well and with urgency, and showing up and being there when decisions are made so that you can help influence them on how that money gets made is even more important right now.
Wonderful. Baha, who works at Dorcas International Refugee Program, says they settled 260 refugees in 55 apartments in the past 5 months, mainly from Afghanistan. And they received information from their national affiliates in Washington, D.C. that HUD's allocated local housing resources for refugees. Do you have any suggestions on strategies to secure housing for refugees?
Well, first of all, thank you for your work. That's incredible work that you're doing and really important. I will have to look into that and get back to you. I'm not familiar with any new resources that HUD has made available. So I'm not sure that there is any new resources. It could be that they are looking at some vouchers that haven't been utilized and setting them aside for this purpose, but I'll have to look into that. So maybe the person who asked that question could feel free to email me so I can follow up with you on that. But that's been one of the challenges with resettling refugees, especially in recent time from Afghanistan, where the federal government brought together senior people at all the agencies and all the departments to figure out what resources they could put towards ensuring that refugees can be resettled well in this country. And housing has stood out as one of the biggest challenges, just as it is in so many other areas of our work. I think there were the Defense Department, for example, and other departments that don't typically work on housing issues may have been surprised to find that there's very little resources available, and housing is a tremendous challenge in many of the communities that they were looking to resettle refugees. So they actually had to shift where they were having people resettle through their program to places where maybe housing was slightly more affordable than it was in other communities. But it's been a real challenge across the country. But I'll look into that to see if there are any new resources from HUD. I'm not familiar with any.
Okay, and last question here. So climate change has increased the likelihood we see climate disasters like those faced by New Orleans or Texas that cause great migrations of people within the country. And it seems like addressing the lack of housing for vulnerable people will become increasingly important, especially as they move into other communities that also don't have enough housing. Are there attempts to tie issues of housing and homelessness to climate change? Should there be? Is this a
Absolutely.
natural coalition?
Yeah. Yes. So we've been working on disaster housing recovery and rebuilding since 2005 after Hurricane Katrina. And at that point, we pulled together a group that we call the Katrina Housing Group. And now we have what we call the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. And it's a coalition, and by we, I mean the National Income Housing Coalition. We've brought this group together and we help lead this group of 850 organizations around the country, most of them from areas impacted by major disasters. So many of these organizations are from New Orleans, from Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, California, from the wildfires and beyond. And these 850 organizations and our Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition work towards the kind of policy changes needed to ensure a complete and just recovery for the lowest income and the most marginalized people. And there's a whole conversation to be had there about the changes that are needed, both through our immediate response and recovery system through FEMA and through HUD and through what more local communities can do to prepare for disasters, all centering the needs of the lowest income and the most marginalized people who, as disasters happen more frequently and with greater severity, it's the lowest income and the most marginalized people who suffer most. They are least able to evacuate prior to a storm, so they're most at risk of dying and major challenges from the storm itself. And then, of course, they have the least resources to be able to recover. So just one example on the housing piece that we have been working on for a long time has been something called a Disaster Housing Assistance Program, a DHAP voucher that low-income people could receive when their home has been damaged or when they've had to evacuate, they've had to move to other parts of the country to help them get back on their feet in affordable, supportive housing and to have the wraparound services that they need. This is something that we helped create after Hurricane Katrina, but have not been able to get implemented ever since for a whole variety of reasons. We're making some headway now with HUD and with FEMA, and I was hopeful that they might have something in place before the next hurricane season, which starts next month. It's looking like it will be delayed, but absolutely there are very clear connections, and the need for wholesale reform of our disaster housing recovery system is urgent.
Well, I want to thank you so much. This has been a wonderful talk, and we've had some great questions and you've had some great answers to them. I know it's not easy to answer on the spot. So, I just want to thank you so much. And, in the chat, if you want to express your thanks, please do. I hope you stick around for the rest of the conference, and we will be returning here at 11:30. I'm going to put a link to the B panels in the chat, so you will also have gotten that in your email. So transformative affordable housing policies will return here at 11:30, and in the B link, it will be the right to housing. So once again, thank you so much, Diane, and thank you for all of the great work you do.
Thank you. Best wishes for the rest of the conference. Thanks, everybody. Take care.